was not the divine morphe. It was not the nature of God. At no point does this passage say that he ceased to possess the divine nature. For in him the whole fullness of the deity dwells bodily, according to the Bible. The kenosis of Philippians 2 verse 7 must be understood in the light of the pleroma of Colossians 2 verse 9. What does it mean then to say that Jesus emptied himself? Some have suggested that he emptied himself by pouring his divinity into his humanity as one pours the contents of one cup into another. This, however, fails to identify the vessel from which Jesus poured out his divine nature when he emptied it into his humanity. A better approach to Philippians chapter 2, verses 6 and 7 is to think of the phrase, taking the form of a servant, as a circumstantial explanation of the kenosis. Since labon is an aorist participle, adverbial in function, here is how we would render this phrase in the first part of verse 7. He emptied himself by taking the form of a servant. The participial phrase is an explanation of how Jesus emptied himself, or what he did that actually constitutes the emptying, the kenosis. While the text does not specify what he emptied himself of, based on the grammatical aspects of the Greek in this passage, it's noteworthy that the form of a servant contrasts sharply with the phrase equality with God. We conclude that it is equality with God, not the form of God, of which Jesus emptied himself. He gave up his equality with God. And this is an accurate conclusion on Erickson's part. Christ did, in fact, divest himself, at least temporarily during his earthly mission, of his equality with God when he entered mortality. That means during his mortal ministry, his earthly ministry, Jesus Christ ceased to function in the position of eternal God. In other words, in his capacity as one of the members of the Godhead. In a sense, one could say that the Son of God was not God for the brief period of approximately 33 years as we would count here on this earth. He relinquished that office in the kenosis, in his emptying of himself. The use of a word kenosis that in classical Greek means to divest oneself of the privilege of an office or a rank was particularly apt in this regard. It's a very good possible interpretation here. Of course, he did so without any time of relinquishing or divesting himself of his divine nature. So we have to understand what this kenosis means. Jesus did not become fully mortal without his divinity. And that's the point. Philippians 2, 6 and 7 must be viewed in the context of God's immutability. Now the light bulbs go on. You say, aha! The scriptures are clear that he has remained the same yesterday, today, and forever. There's no question about that. That is their teaching. Yet for a brief period, it was necessary for Christ to step away from being the eternal God so that he could become like us. There was a time when Jesus ceased functioning as God. He was no longer equal with God. Holding the position or office of God is not the point on which immutability is measured. I'm going to say that again, because this is critical in understanding immutability. The unchangeableness of God does not mean that there is not a time when God is not God. That is not the nature of immutability, as Jesus shows us. What is it that did not change about him? It was clearly his divine nature. However, Holding the position or office of God is not how immutability is measured, as Francis Beckwith thinks. It is his divine nature. The kenosis of Philippians 2, 6 and 7 proves that whether a person, such as Christ, functions in the office of God at all times or not is irrelevant to the biblical doctrine of immutability. Consistent with the other types of changes that we've talked about in these videos, biblical immutability is not about God's office, his title, or his position. Immutability is about God's divine nature. That is, his perfect character and personality. Knowing that, we see the Scriptures are absolutely correct. There is no contradiction in the Bible here. There is no contradiction between the Bible, the Book of Mormon, and the Doctrine and Covenants. God is absolutely the same, yesterday, today, and forever. And yet he does change. It is how God is the same yesterday, today, and forever that is important to grasp. As to his divine personality, as to his character of always loving righteousness and hating wickedness, and as his divine character of fulfilling his promises and always dealing in one eternal round of seeking to exalt men, women, children, all of humankind who will, that is how God never changes. He never gives up on us. He never says, you know what, this is a completely worthless project, forget it. I give up. They're never going to do this. That's not God's character to change in that manner. Even though we know immutability does not apply to his body. And that is a dramatic change. So God does change. And God doesn't change. The key to immutability is understanding what about God changes and what about God remains the same. The only constancy is change in this world. I mean, that's the law of entropy, you know. All things run down. That's the second law of thermodynamics. That's just the way it is. This is so enlightening that the immutability of God, according to classical Christian theology, assumes that he always has to have been God. And that is a misstep in the theology of the Christians. Immutability does not teach that God has always had to remain God. That's not true. Jesus Christ refutes that handily, as does Philippians 2, 6 and 7. It does teach that as to his personality, his character, and his will to keep his word and carry out his plan, that never changes.
Now, it's important to understand that while many passages in the Scriptures definitely teach that God has always existed throughout all eternity, no passage teaches what Dr. Beckwith claims, that God, and specifically God the Son, has always existed as God throughout all eternity. What then does the Bible say about the length of time during which the Son of God has been God? That is, a member of the Godhead.
And here we're going to learn a most remarkable, interesting mystery about God. I'm going to teach you about the mysteries of God as taught in the Scriptures. We have a pure, fabulous revelation of this concept. Colossians 1:17 states that God has existed prior to all things, and in him all things endure together. Notably, the passage does not say that he has existed as God prior to all things. It simply said he's existed prior to all things, but not as God. Now, you might think this is a little bit picky, but let's explore this. Dr. Beckwith's added terminology, as God. He has existed as God before all things, as God. That's his additional interpretation. That is not what the Bible teaches.